Hello.
Hey, poster child.
How are you?
I'm good. I was talking about your wall.
Yeah, I figured.
Maybe your life. I don't know.
Well, I think, maybe for something, maybe. Let me get my headphones plugged in here. Okay. That looks framed a little bit better. How's it going?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a long week.
Yeah.
It's almost over, though. We're getting close.
It's just going to be another week, you know.
I know. And until I die. So it's like best case scenario, the week's end, which I'm not sure is really all that much to look forward to.
There might be a cruise in there somewhere.
Maybe I'll take a vacation before then.
So how was the Heterodox Academy, Katie Herzog?
It was good. It was very refreshing in a lot of ways to be in a group of people who agree with me more than they disagree with me, I think. And that's not entirely true. I'm sure that a lot of people there also disagreed with me and I would disagree with them. But it was just like very refreshing to have sort of a lot of open conversations about things that are happening in the world without being afraid of being labeled a whatever.
This, that, or the other thing.
Exactly. All of it. The sessions were very interesting. I met some people that I admire a lot, which was good. It was good.
Did you meet Alice Dreger?
I did, yes. Alice is fascinating. She's probably the most independent thinker I've ever met. Like, while everyone at the conference is sort of, there's a lot of talk about, viewpoint diversity on campus, free speech on campus. Alice pointed out repeatedly that, the corporatization of campuses and state legislatures using their hands to stifle research and speech is also a huge deal. And in some ways, I think a bigger deal. And she was good about pointing that out when everybody else is talking about, the students.
Yeah, the students are right on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that they hit you where it counts. I mean, they hit parents and prospective students and stuff, but the nefarious underbelly of the academic institution is probably more of a follow the money sort of story.
Right. The Koch brothers, I think in particular, have had a huge influence on a lot of schools, including public schools, over the past few years, which is a very big deal. And something we should probably be paying more attention to. But it's so much more fun to write about the dumb students. It's just like emotionally, in some ways it's a better story.
Yeah, it's more satisfying,
it's more dramatic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard unless you're a fly on the wall. And even then, all the real issues are so encrusted with very dry middle management speak.
Totally. And that requires a lot more digging into public records and things like that than think pieces on kids these days, which are incredibly fun to write. I love writing those pieces.
Do you have another one in the works?
I don't. Yeah, not at this moment. If something happens, then I'll write about it. And I'm sure, summer is here, so maybe we'll wait until fall before the next round of think pieces come out.
Yeah, right. Do you know Jesse Singal personally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I met him for the first time in New York during the conference. Not during the conference, we met before that. But so Jesse and I had originally, my first encounter with Jesse's work was when I was writing about detransition last year. Jesse is really the authority in terms of reporters doing this work.
Okay.
He wrote a really big piece for New York Mag last year on Ken Zucker and what happened at his clinic. Ken Zucker is basically reviled by the trans community and a lot of progressives. And his clinic was shut down in Toronto. It's a really fascinating story. I recommend reading it. Based on a lot of sort of slander and smears and false allegations about misbehavior. So his clinic was shut down. His career was essentially ended. And Jesse wrote a really fantastic piece about that. So I got in touch with him for the first time last year when I was writing about detransition, because part of what I wanted to write about was the response that people have when you write about this issue. And so I had also gotten in touch with Alice Dreger. So my first interaction with both of them was during that time period. And I ended up originally there was a section in my detransition piece about that, about the public outcry when people talk about or report about detransition. And then it ended up getting edited out, which was ultimately a very good thing, because the piece was such a hot button thing that like pulling in all this other stuff would have made the outcry even bigger. So, but that's how I first kind of met both him and Dreger.
Yeah, I've not read his recent piece for The Atlantic, was it?
Yeah,
but
it's very long.
See the stuff that's going on around it.
Yeah, the outcry has been really, really crazy. Jesse's piece is like 12,000 words. It's really nuanced, and he did the same thing I did in my piece, which is he went out of his way to affirm trans identities and to say, for most trans adults, social or medical transition ends up being a way of easing dysphoria. The research backs that up. But, also a high percentage of kids that show up to gender clinics end up desisting, which essentially means like growing out of it, and end up being gay and lesbian kids. I don't know if Jesse actually said that, but that's sort of what all the research shows. So I thought his piece was great. The outcry has been really crazy and
not unexpected.
Not unexpected in the slightest. I mean, there are some things that are like The Atlantic is, it's a big publication, and so I guess it should have been expected that like Lena Dunham would get in on this. But like she called him an asshole on Twitter. She's never met him. Nicole Cliff, another writer who has 80,000 followers on Twitter, tweeted that Jesse is, quote, obsessed with trans women, which is a complete fabrication. And to me, like anybody in the media, especially like with Lena Dunham, it kind of enraged me in part because she's the subject of misreporting and smears all the time. I'm not the biggest Lena Dunham fan, but I do think that she's often portrayed falsely and like maligned unfairly in the media. And so I think when that happens, ideally you learn something from that experience. And what you should learn is that life is more complex than what you read on Twitter. And you should maybe talk to people before you call them assholes or call them creeps or call them obsessed or shit like that. So to me, it's just like hugely disappointing that these smart figures would read this piece, believe all of the shit that they read on Twitter, and they're not engaging with the arguments of the piece at all. They're just saying like, Jesse's a cis man, he's dangerous, he's transphobic, he shouldn't be writing this.
I wonder, I'm halfway through Alice Dreger's book that you recommended, Galileo's Middle Finger, and it seems like she was embroiled, or the book is about academics who get embroiled in activist backlash, and one of the main threads in the book is about, it starts out with intersex and then it goes into the trans community, and it seems like the dynamics that were in place whenever that was happening in the mid-90s have just grown and grown and grown. The issue, it's the same set of issues. It's let's look at the facts. This is a contentious issue, but why do you think the trans issue is it novel for being so touchy? Are there? No, I don't. I mean, I think it's social media that is really the difference between, like, Alice in her book, she covers, controversies that were coming out of like the 90s and the early 2000s. And a lot of them were based on these sort of esoteric academic papers that, in like the 80s and early 90s, when people were writing about these controversial things, studies of trans populations, they weren't being disseminated to the wider public. Okay.
These fights existed only in academia. And then with the internet, much of the media, like what we do is, people aggregate studies, not always well. And then it's like the reporting about the study that sort of blows these stories up. And I don't think that's new, but it is more common in social media. And it's just like, trans issues 10 years ago were much smaller. This wasn't something, this was, pre-Caitlyn Jenner, pre-Laverne Cox. People just weren't, it wasn't as much of a thing in media and in culture. But yeah, it's
Okay.
crazy. People's reactions to this. I think when you write, like you write about gender, you write about race, sex, this is going to happen.
If you take a nuanced view on these very very passionate issues for whatever reason, it seems like, and maybe there's just a timeline going on. It seems that the gay and lesbian issues after the marriage equality thing, which I know it's not settled yet, but it seems like it's not such a big deal anymore.
Yeah.
And the new big deal is trans issues, and it seems that the past 5 years have seen such radical change, at least in the media, on the reportage, whereas the gay and lesbian community were probably more represented for a much longer time.
Oh yeah, I think that's totally true. I guess when I was working on my detransition piece, I got in touch with Media Matters and GLAAD and some other organizations that sort of monitor the coverage of LGBTQ, media stories. And what I wanted to find is just the like spike in the number of stories that have happened in the past 5 years, and nobody actually had that data. But I mean, anecdotally, it seems like, yes, this is something that most people are aware of and we talk about, and it's new. I mean, I'm queer, like trans communities aren't new to me at all. Yeah. This is like, I've been sort of tangentially, sort of next door to that community for the last 15 years, but it has penetrated the public consciousness.
Yeah. Do you think that it'll just naturally calm down on its own, or do you think it's always going to be a pretty intense issue?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, my feeling is probably yes, it will calm down, but with trans stuff, the interesting thing to me about trans stuff is that you have sort of, let's just say you have a broad acceptance in American culture, and that's probably not true, but let's just say that for a second. Outside of that, there are essentially 3 camps of people who are, let's say, critical of the dominant narrative about sort of trans issues in the media, and that's conservatives, who I think, specifically religious conservatives, who, it's tied to their like dislike of gay people, like it's an affront to Jesus or whatever. And then there's radical feminists. So radical feminists who also call themselves gender critical basically rejects the idea that gender exists. So the easiest way I think to think about it is every time you hear the word gender in your mind, you mentally replace it with gender roles.
Okay. Right.
So they're not saying there's a woman gender. They're saying there are gender roles. Yeah. But this idea that, gender, essentially like gender is a social construct. That's also the same thing that trans activists argue all the time. And so I think for radical feminists, it's basically like the argument is essentially like putting on a dress doesn't make you female. Yeah. It might make you a woman because gender is a social construct, and the terms woman and man are let's say that's the sociology, and male and female are the biology.
Okay.
Does this make any sense?
No, okay, it does. It's so.
Yeah,
it's a nuanced view right from.
It's totally nuanced, and it's also like the interesting thing about it is that rad femmes and conservative Christians are on opposite sides of the political spectrum in almost every other issue. Yeah. Except maybe like being anti-sex work, which a lot of radical feminists are, and trans stuff. And so what you see sometimes is radical feminists and conservative Christians coalescing and coming together in that sort of an uncomfortable bedfellows. So you have those two camps that are
they come together to battle what you call the dominant media narrative about trans, which would be presumably pro-trans.
Right. And, yes. And terms like pro and con, that I feel like that's a little bit more black and white. Okay. But there's also been lawsuits that some radical feminists have been involved with that have been sort of bankrolled by conservative Christian groups. Some radical feminists like sign on to anti-bathroom bills, like Washington State was last year, and the year before, and probably this year too. Groups will like try to get an initiative on the ballot so to get people to vote again. What they want is for people to vote against, the ability to use the bathroom of your choosing rather than the bathroom of your birth certificate.
Okay.
So you have those two groups, and then you have researchers who are also divided. Research, like sex and gender researchers, or mostly sex researchers. And I think that those are the group, like the researchers are who we should be listening to.
And the researchers are generally critical of the dominant narrative.
I don't know that I can say that they're generally critical, but they just look at the science. Ideally, you just look at the science, and what most of the science says, specifically about trans kids, and this is hugely debated in the trans community. Like every time you say this, they say this is bad data, but all of the studies over the past 30 years looking at trans kids have showed that the majority of trans kids, or let's just say a high percentage, not even the majority, a high percentage of children who show up to gender identity clinics eventually desist. So they end up identifying as their sex at birth. And most of them end up growing into lesbian women and gay men.
It's more that's what the issue of sexuality than... Right.
It's sort of essentially. So that's what the science says. And I tend to believe the scientists.
Well, when a young person desists from a transition, have you read any data about what hormones do and then stopping the hormones? Well,
this could even be people who aren't even on. So that would be, I would consider that more like detransition. If you've actually socially transitioned and started taking either puberty blockers or opposite sex hormones, getting surgery. So desist is more like you go to a gender, you like have confusion about your gender, tell your parents, they take you to the clinic, and then maybe nothing happens or maybe something does. So this is just like children who are patients at gender identity clinics. They might not necessarily actually have socially transitioned or medically transitioned.
Okay. But so I guess there's a social cost, or at least a time spent in transitioning, and I guess transitioning in the soft cultural level, and then desisting in that. There's a social cost and a time cost of training yourself or trying to do that. But then there's a physical cost once it comes into hormones and stuff. And do you know if we have solid science on that?
I don't know. That's a really great question. And I looked into it during my piece. And when I was working on my piece, and the research is sort of not there. If you give someone puberty blockers and they don't go through puberty, so that means that they won't develop secondary sex characteristics, but we don't know how that affects the brain.
Yeah.
So, which, I'm sort of speaking out of my ass here, but I assume that puberty also affects the brain in serious ways. And it's like, I don't know, probably if you have a dog that goes through puberty before you neuter the dog and a dog that doesn't go through puberty before you neuter it, there's probably some differences, some psychological differences there. Not to compare people to dogs. Don't.
Yeah.
Nobody starts showing up at the strangers saying that I compare trans people to dogs. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that clearly needs further study. And this, people have been transitioning socially forever and medically for decades.
Yeah.
But when it comes to kids on blockers and things like that, it's all much, much more new. So I think it'll probably be a while before we can see long-term benefits or costs.
Do you see a pattern in the reaction to pieces about detransitioning or desisting?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the pattern is is all this, yeah.
In Alice Dreger's book, the issue that she was dealing with, or the story that she's dealing with, is about a man who is forwarding the theory that there's two types of trans male to female. There's one who identifies as woman early on, and then there's this there's another kind who wants to become a woman or find sexual satisfaction in the idea of being a woman.
And autogynephilia.
Autogynephilia. And the tension seemed to be in the trans community, or the people who were involved in that there was something about the definition or the category that they didn't want anybody looking into.
Right. Which completely, if you look at it on a social level, it completely makes sense. Like gay activists. So the idea with so the guy who came up with his typology, his name is Ray Blanchard. And this was written about this. So he wrote about this in, academic papers. And then this was sort of popularized by a guy, I think it was at University of Chicago, maybe Northwestern, Mike Bailey. And so both of them were targeted by trans activists, Blanchard for coming up with the typology, and then Bailey for popularizing the typology. And it makes complete sense that people would be resistant to this idea, because just like, gay activists before gay marriage divorced sort of sex, what's happening in the bedroom from what's happening in the living room. Like you don't want the issue to be eroticized, because it makes people less likely to sort of look at you as a human being. So it makes complete sense that people would be uncomfortable with the idea that, there's a percentage of trans women who sort of the root of their behavior comes from that it has an erotic component. But that doesn't mean it's not true. And there's plenty of trans women who are willing to talk about autogynephilia and their sort of erotic experiences around it. But it's highly controversial. People do not like it.
Yeah, for numerous reasons. Do you have any feelings or intuitions or an idea of why the topic of detransition is a hot button issue? Does that destabilize the trans activists in a certain way?
Yeah, clearly.
Argument?
It's it's frequently compared to the idea of ex-gays. So if you can be gay and you can change your mind, then being gay isn't this sort of intractable part of your identity. It's a choice, not the way that you're born. And I don't know actually how good the science is on whether people are born gay or not. Attraction certainly doesn't feel like a choice to me, but acting on the attraction is a choice. And so I think there's an element of that, of suspicion towards detrans people and these stories, because it can, if people lack all nuance and are unwilling to accept that the world is not black and white, it can give this impression that being trans is something that
it's a phase.
It's a phase, right. And that's hugely threatening to people, especially when they're, fighting for civil rights. If you talk to detrans people, what they'll say is it is not equivalent to being ex-gay. And in fact, most of them are actually gay, or many of them are actually gay. And I think one of the fundamental differences here is that when you had organizations like Exodus International, an ex-gay organization, it was mostly teens whose families were homophobic sending them to these ex-gay camps, and who were essentially trying to pray the gay away. Yeah. And it doesn't work. All of these, a new one actually popped up this year, but for the most part, they're based in, Christian ideology.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's moralizing an issue that really shouldn't be moralized. So for the detransitioners, it's just, they don't see the parallel. And I'm inclined to believe them, because at least all of the detransitioners I've spoke to have been adults. They haven't been forced to detransition. In fact, for most of them, their lives were better and they were received better in society when they were trans.
Their psychological health, socially, but internally?
Socially. Yeah, their psychological health. I think psychologically I'm sure it's individual, but I think just socially, they had a community, they had the queer community, they had the trans community. There's a lot of sort of positive feedback. And when you give that up, you're also giving up your community very frequently. These people are super brave. And I wish they weren't such a threat to everybody else, because they deserve to have their stories told.
Huh. Yeah. Oh, yeah. deserve to have their stories told and deserve to have their stories respected and not used by the anti-trans community.
Right. And that's a big concern as well. That, you know, these stories will be used by the anti-trans community to sort of argue that it's not real. Or they say things like, you know, they'll say that women who've had top surgery have been mutilated. They use like language like that just doesn't make anybody feel good, you know?
Yeah. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the difference between moralizing an issue and pathologizing an issue. This is a pretty subtle argument. I'm just having the idea now where it's homosexuality and trans issues. It's not, if you moralize it, then it gets really muddy and you're starting to try to solve a problem without really understanding the problem because your morals are in the way. But there's also, and maybe this is just a cultural construct with psychology, but there's also a way of pathologizing issues, like saying that this is a malfunction or a brain malfunction and stuff. And I know we have to be really careful with that, but is that another way of murking the water, or how do you look at research and pathologize?
Well, I mean, that's interesting, because one of the contradictions in some, let's just call it trans ideology, is that this is just the way you're born. It's essentially, it's an identity, it's an orientation. However, gender dysphoria is listed in the DSM as a pathology, and it has to be if you want insurance to cover it. Oh. So that's a problem in itself, where you have some trans activists saying there's nothing wrong with me, this isn't a mental illness, this isn't a pathology. However, you still need it to be considered a pathology if you want insurance to cover, you know, hormone therapy or any kind of surgery.
And the difference between somebody whose orientation is for the same sex is that the society around the attitudes towards homosexuality can relieve the pressure on them, but somebody with gender dysphoria, every time they look in a mirror, there's a disorientation. At least
that's
my
what
good
people
friend
say.
Says.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my own personal experience. So I was what now would be called a dysphoric child. But I was, you know, in the 80s, I was called a tomboy, but now I would be called gender nonconforming or dysphoric. And so to me, I was the kind of kid who I dressed like a boy. I was the only girl in Little League. I was frequently, and still am, this actually happened yesterday, and it happened earlier this week. Misgendered. I get misgendered all the time, which it bothered me a hell of a lot when I was a kid, because it bothered me if I was like with my family, because my family would correct whoever called me young man or whatever. Yeah. If I was alone, I would go with it. I would tell people my name was Kyle. So I can't really remember your question, but I do, from my own personal experience, I wanted to be a boy, but I think my suspicion is that I wanted to be a boy because I wanted to do boy things. I also had an older brother who I looked up to. You know, I wanted to skateboard. I wanted to do all sort of the boy things. I liked their clothes better. I thought that if I peed standing up, I would eventually grow up with a penis. And like, there's this, Quillette had which didn't happen, by the way. Quillette had
a big mess, though, I'm sure. Yeah.
Quillette had a podcast recently on, their podcast is called Wrong Speak, but they did an episode on gender dysphoria and trans kids. And someone they spoke to on the show pointed out that for most people with dysphoria, there's a huge discomfort with puberty. And I absolutely experienced that. But I still am not sure it's because dysphoria was something that I was born with, or because I live in a society that said, this is what boys do, this is what girls do. You know, so still every time, like, I wear men's clothing, and every time I go shopping, it's sort of uncomfortable because I'm shopping in the men's section, and anytime somebody like asks me if I want help, I sort of like, I shouldn't be here. But that's not because there's something wrong with me. That's because we live in a fucked up society that says boys like blue and girls like pink, and men like pants and women like skirts or whatever.
Do you jive with the social constructionist idea that gender is not there at all, or?
No, I think that biology and gender are closely aligned. but I also think there are outliers, and I think I'm an outlier. But I think that, for the vast majority of people, they're okay with, women's clothing, men's clothing. I think when you look at work and career choice, I think there's also people will argue that the Damore memo, a lot of people really hated what he had to say for a lot of reasons, but part of his argument, I think, was that women are more interested in people, men are more interested in things. Generally. And so when you look at more the most egalitarian societies on earth, in Scandinavia, where you do sort of have equal opportunity, you still see these big differences in career choice. So I don't think there's anything wrong with this idea that women are more interested, or let's say females, are more interested in people and males are more interested in things. I mean, you can look at studies of chimps that, apparently chimps are male chimps are more likely or gravitate towards what we would call male-oriented toys, like trucks and shit like that, and female chimps, gravitate towards female toys, or like human and female toys. I think that's really fascinating. I do think there's some biological basis of it. However, it's to the social constructionist, it's acknowledging this is sexist. What I think we should do, however, is acknowledge it and adjust society accordingly. So pay women's work better. That to me, that's the solution. Isn't to say that there should be more
everybody.
Right. I think that women's work should be just as highly compensated as, engineering or whatever. And so to me, I think the flaw is in the way that we sort of what we do with the argument, not the argument itself.
Yeah. I wonder, this is kind of going back and stuff, but one of the things that I think a lot about since doing the Evergreen story and looking at activism as a cultural phenomena, especially with allies, or what you were saying about Lena Dunham or Dunham. And what people are doing to Jesse Singal right now, it seems like there's a fetishization of the outlier, where the outlier, and this has to do maybe with the progressive mindset of finding the most rarish, precious bird and construing that as the oppressed one, and then getting a lot of social capital out of going to the rescue of this thing. But there's something about it that's actually, it seems demeaning to me, and patronizing to these groups. Like a pylon is ever going to solve anything, people don't think that. A
pylon has never fucking solved anything. Although, I mean,
D-Day was a great pylon.
Right. I mean, well, if you look at, I do think that despite how much I cannot stand pylons, I do think that, if you look at right now what's happening with the separation of immigrant families, I do think that, for whatever reason, when it comes to politics, I think nuance is always clearly lost, again, no matter what the issue is. But I do think some effective political change can come from really huge social media campaigns.
Yeah, from an outcry.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't like is when it's focused on, with the exception of Donald Trump, focus on him all you want. But I don't like when it's focused on a reporter, or some random person who wore the wrong prom dress. To me, that just seems like a waste of energy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. What energy is that? It's that that 5-minute crapping energy. I have 5 minutes in my phone to kill. Right. So what am I going to put my attention into? I
mean, I think people join these pylons for a very fundamental reason. It's the group. People want to be a part of the group, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. And there's something fun about being a part of it, but it's still fucked up.
Yeah. Well, and somebody who is an independent journalist such as yourself. I mean, I watch your I watch your comments on The Stranger, and I just have to say this. I know that this isn't your problem, but I hate The Stranger's comment system. It's so screwed up. But I can't. You can't reply to anybody, and nobody.
You can't reply to anybody. Yeah,
nobody
you can't.
knows what's going on.
Yeah, maybe in like a year or 10 we'll fix that. We're sort of behind the times when it comes to digital presence, but our print product looks great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as do your covers for the most part. So
yeah.
But somebody, as an independent journalist, I'm sure, and we don't have time to talk about this right now, but I'm sure that you've gone on that the experiences you have, especially in Seattle, writing about the things that you've written about and getting the backlash that you've gotten has made you more aware of the group and more aware, or maybe to start question what it is to be an individual. What is it to...
Oh, for sure.
To stop trusting things. And
yeah, for sure. That's one of the reasons I like Alice Dreger so much. Is she was going to be a part of Barry Weiss's intellectual dark web piece, and Alice backed out, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest, because Alice is, I think, really is like very anti-tribal. And so it doesn't make sense for her to be in any sort of group, even if it's an anti-tribal group. Like, Alice is not a part of any tribe. And I think I admire that. I mean, I think it gives you a clearer perspective if you're not looking towards what the people beside you are nodding along with before you make your decision about how you feel about things.
But do you still find yourself needing allies, mentors, and people on your side, or just people that you can look up to help guide you or point out?
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I do. Seattle is sort of a difficult city to be in for that, because I don't really have many allies. I have like a couple of friends who I can talk honestly about this stuff with, but for the most part, I don't. But I also I'm like very lucky in that I have a girlfriend who
is wise and sagacious.
She's offline. That's what she is. She doesn't if I try to explain to her all of the Twitter drama that's happening, she just sort of rolls her eyes and like, this is fucking unimportant. She's also a nurse, so she sees like actual human suffering every day, which is good to put into perspective. I think being single in this city would be incredibly difficult for me, especially because I'm queer. And so, and largely hated by the queer community in Seattle. So that makes a big difference for me. It's just that when I go home, I am not by myself thinking why isn't my phone ringing? I know why it's not ringing. So I'm very lucky in that. And I have very good bosses. Dan Savage. And who is of course Dan Savage, and then Tim Keck, who's my publisher, are very supportive of me. And so I'm also lucky in that sense that I have institutional support. Even if there are people screaming with pitchforks outside of our window.
I have to go to work and drive a bus to Puyallup.
All right. Well, I hope traffic isn't too bad for you.
We'll see. You never know.
Yeah. I mean, you do know. It's always bad, right?
No, it's not always bad. They're doing work. Those road warriors, they're making the lanes much better. It's getting much better over time, especially the Tacoma Bend and stuff like that. But every once in a while, somebody crashes into somebody else, and then an engine block ends up on the other side of the road, and then you're just hey, well, there's no way going back.
Do you get paid extra if you have to sit in traffic all day?
I get a really nice healthcare package. I think it includes psychological counseling. I haven't looked into that. Do you have another episode coming out for the PBS thing?
I do. Actually, one came out yesterday
cool.
About, what's it about? It's about a digester system that turns food scraps into energy.
So like a stomach that you put in your backpack?
It's basically. It's bigger than that. It's the size of a storage unit.
Okay. So what is it going to make, a Goodyear blimp out of methane?
Well, it makes natural gas.
Oh, okay. All right. So
or I don't know if it's natural gas, but it makes something that you can power things with. But they're coming out every 2 weeks, so.
Okay, yeah, and it's usually about renewable. Or
it's all about saving the planet kind of shit. Yeah. So it'll last as long as my haters figure out that I'm doing this, and they start spamming PBS with complaints.
Do you really have that many haters, or is it just a vocal
They're
minority?
loud. I mean,
Yeah.
they're really loud. It's a vocal minority for sure. And I get a lot of support as well, but it usually comes in the form of an email than in like a public declaration.
Yeah,
you know?
and that's been for about a year then since you did the detransitioning piece. That's when it.
Yeah, that's when it started. And had I shut up at that point, it would have stopped by now. But oh well.
Is it too late for you to shut up?
I could change my tune. I could denounce myself and I don't know, come out as trans.
You could. You could pray the press away, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
Do a detransitioning piece.
Yeah.